Ethiopia recently signed a memorandum of understanding with Somaliland, which declared its independence from Somalia in 1991 and has not been recognized internationally. According to Somaliland, this agreement will give Ethiopia seaport access in return for the recognition of Somaliland as an independent state. This deal has led to a fallout with the government in Mogadishu. Somalia describes the agreement as a, quote, violation of its sovereignty. President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud promptly signed a law nullifying the pact, and Prime Minister Hamza Abdi Bare has vowed to defend Somalia's territory by, quote, all legal means possible. This week, we'll look at the controversial Ethiopia-Somaliland port deal and its implications for the Horn of Africa region. I'm Peninah Karibe in Nairobi. Welcome to Talk Africa. Joining me now to unpack the implications of the Ethiopia-Somaliland deal are, from New York, Professor David Onserio Monda, Professor of Public Policy and Constitutional Law at City University of New York. From Kampala in Uganda, we have Ambassador Simon Mulongo, former Deputy Head of AMISOM and consultant on governance, peace and security. And joining me here in studio is Professor Francis Onditi. He is an Associate Professor of Conflictology at Riara University here in Kenya. Welcome to all three of you, gentlemen. And Professor Onditi, I will begin with you. Ethiopia has traditionally conducted its maritime transactions through the port of Djibouti. And in any case, if it needed options, it does have the immediate neighbor Eritrea. So why go to Somaliland and why now?
Thank you, Peninah, and our colleagues. I think I read two things here. One, Somaliland is trying to avoid what we call, international isolation. While on the other hand, Ethiopia is going through what one could call, Renaissance expedition. It is Renaissance because you'll agree that, the bond between Somaliland and Ethiopia, it's long, since 1800. And so recently when Somalia got into partnership with the East African community, the admission that just happened recently, I believe it put Somaliland into some kind of awkward situation that I am now alone. What should I do? Now, the instinct will tell you that you need a new friend. So the new friend for Somaliland is Ethiopia, and but the challenge is it could be a conduit for conflict, a widespread Horn of Africa conflict, and that's why it is important that that deal, there is a need for review and, reflection on issues that are emerging as a result of that. Okay,
yeah. So you say it could be a conduit for instability in the Horn of Africa.
Exactly.
So let's look at the specifics of all the contents of this MOU that was signed on January 1st this year. Somaliland will grant Ethiopia access to the sea for commercial traffic through a port. Somaliland will also lease a section of its coastline to Ethiopia's navy. And in exchange, Somaliland will get a share in Ethiopian Airlines, the country's successful national carrier. Plus, Somaliland stated that Ethiopia would recognize it as an independent state, something that no other country has done in the 30 years since Somaliland pulled away from Somalia. And so there's a lot of questions here. First, Ambassador Mulongo, why does Ethiopia need a naval presence?
There are immediate things that are pushing Ethiopia to take that route. The first one being that Ethiopia is facing serious internal contradictions, which threaten the coherence and even survival of singularity as a country. And I think it is the intent of the Ethiopian leadership to divert that by creating an externalized attention which is intended to rally the country together. Because in the north, it is still a very difficult agenda to quieten the Tigrayan area and also to respond to the current active conflict with the Amhara community, who are up in arms against the central government. So by externalizing the challenge and bringing in this issue of the strategic access to the international waters is really to rally the population together. And it seems to be quietly paying off because a number of Ethiopians are up and happy for this kind of move. The other one is that the Prime Minister would like really, for a long time, Ethiopia has been struggling to have an access since they lost the coastline to Eritrea. And because they already had some inroads through DP World in Berbera, where they have shares in the port. I think it became a softer point for them to penetrate. And to me, this is a deliberate calculation done by the Prime Minister, and it's not something as simple as it is being seen on the paper. It is something deeper, something with a lot of studies done, and I'm sure they're prepared for some repercussions. So they're very determined.
Okay. Right. So looking at the other aspect of this MOU, Professor Monda, is that Ethiopia has now introduced the aspect of asset swap. I mean, a stake in Ethiopian Airlines to Somaliland. How would such a deal work? How would they actualize it?
So this is actually the big question. How do you actualize a deal where an international entity in the name of the state of Ethiopia is engaging directly with subnational units, in this case, Somaliland? So the preferable scenario here would be for bilateral relations, which would be directly between Addis Ababa and Mogadishu. So it's not very clear exactly how the elements of that MOU will actually be actualized, because it's a diplomatic problem, it's a political problem, but it's also a constitutional problem. Having said that, I think it's mutually beneficial for both sides. In this case, Somaliland as a part of Somalia, and also for Ethiopia to engage in this iteration. For Ethiopia, as we've mentioned before, it offers the country multiple alternatives, access to global maritime shipping points, and essentially critical global maritime choke points in the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. But for Somaliland, it offers the hope eventually of getting recognition from Ethiopia, the seat of the African Union, but also benefiting incredibly from that vast market of over 100 million people in Ethiopia. So as it stands right now, I'm not quite sure exactly how the details of this MOU will be ironed out, particularly when you think about how the assets would move from Addis Ababa to Hargeisa and vice versa, and whether Mogadishu would just sit back and watch Ethiopia trade shares or assets with Somaliland while Mogadishu is actually left in the cold. I think these are areas of serious questions.
Right, and it's interesting what Professor Monda has said. And I would imagine the trickiest bit in this whole deal is the part about recognizing Somaliland as an independent state. I mean, Somaliland has all the trappings of a country, including a working political system, regular elections, a police force, and its own currency. Ambassador Mulongo, how do these two, Somaliland and Somalia, operate? Just give us some context.
Definitely, as my colleague has just alluded to, it is a very big challenge because issues of recognition and legitimacy are at play here. And you know well that the international community have been very firm ever since the recovery of Somalia into the current reconstituted state arrangements, is to not recognize the secession of Somaliland. This is because it can really pose a danger to the unity of the entire Somalia. The international community believes that the question of secession or belonging of Somaliland and any other constituent states in Somalia should be the question of the entire Somalia, where the Somalis themselves would determine that. But we external people should not help and aid into the disintegration of Somalia. The second one is that it is a war. Ethiopia is working on the possibility that Somaliland will win the war of secession.
Okay, so Professor Nditi, listening to all of that, is this deal aligned to international law or does it contravene it?
Yes and no. Yes, because no, because if you look at what we call the international, legal doctrines, the five: sovereignty, effectiveness, territorial integrity, and self-determination. The first four are being violated by Somaliland. Should they proceed or should they pursue their deal with, Ethiopia? But the last one, self-determination, is something that it's not very clear. It's ambiguous within the international instruments of law. So if you look at it from that perspective, yes, they have a right to pursue that. But out of the 193, none of these countries recognizes Somaliland as a state. It is a territory, but we know from the history that the country has, the region has been living in a bit of isolation, from the southern or the main Somalia. And so when you look at it from that perspective, I think it would be important to perhaps strike a deal of, pursue the one state, the one state solution that has existed for all these years. But it will call for a lot of give and take, carrot and stick from Mogadishu, but also from Hargeisa.
Okay. Well, so Professor Monda, Somalia has nullified this MOU, but on Monday this week, the army chiefs of Ethiopia and Somaliland had a meeting in Addis Ababa. Ethiopia's military said in a statement that that meeting was about possible ways to work together. That's a direct quote. So can such a deal then go ahead without Somalia's approval?
I think both Somaliland and Ethiopia can go ahead without without Somalia's approval, simply because Somalia has its own internal contradictions and its own internal challenges that it cannot avoid. By that I mean, large sections of the contiguous area of Somalia are outside of the control of the central government in Mogadishu. So you can imagine how much more difficult it would be for the central government in Mogadishu to try and control an area as far away as Somaliland when the Somali government can't even control the greater areas of Mogadishu. They're relying on the Kenyan, Ethiopia, Uganda, Burundi, the East African force within the region to support them with that. So I guess Somalia has really found itself in a difficult position where external actors, in this case Ethiopia, is actually pursuing its own vital interests, vital strategic interests, by undermining the government in Mogadishu and going directly to interact with a subnational unit in the case of Somaliland. I think the crux of the issue will be, will Ethiopia actually formally recognize Somaliland as an independent state, and will Ethiopia do Somaliland's bidding within international diplomatic and political fora to get more countries to recognize Somaliland as separate from Somalia? I think that's where the problem will be, because right now major powers, including Turkey, including the United States, including Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Egypt, are solidly behind maintaining the status quo in terms of Somaliland remaining a part of Somalia.
All right. Well, thank you very much for all of this insight. So we're going to take a short break now. And when we come back, we will continue our discussion on the implications for the Horn of the Ethiopia-Somaliland deal. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Professor David Onserio Monda Ambassador Simon Mulongo and Professor Francis Onditi. Now, before the break, we looked at some of the details of the deal signed between Ethiopia and Somaliland. Let's now look at some of its ramifications on the region. Ambassador Mulongo, I'll begin with you. Ethiopia, with more than 100 million people, is the most populous landlocked country in the world. What challenges does it face as a landlocked country? And not just it, but other landlocked countries too, such as Uganda, where you are.
Of course, landlocked countries face a lot of challenges, particularly to the common means of transport and movement of goods between continents and of course between powers in various continents. And as such, trade and business becomes very expensive. All big countries with huge populations, whether it is Russia, whether it is the United States, whether it is Nigeria, all these have access to the sea. And so the debate has been on for a while in countries that are landlocked and those that have bigger population and have bigger aspirations, like Ethiopia, to see how best they can go around the problem of accessibility. Unfortunately for us, these borders were designated by the colonial masters, and we have the 1963 declaration agreed that we go by those borders. And the agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea was such that after the war, Eritrea will resume its independence, and that goes with all the ports along the Red Sea. And as such, Ethiopia was left without. And as such, yes, they're burning with the problem, and I know it is such a serious problem. The question is, how can they go around it? The Prime Minister a couple of months ago did promise that he would deliver Ethiopia with the route to the sea by any means, whether peaceful, negotiated, or by war. And I didn't know that it was meaning actually what he's just decided to do. But that has ramifications in terms of security, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of even conflict catching fire across the region, as it has been explained. Because within Ethiopia, they're sitting on a powder keg. And now you have Somalia is actually simmering with the conflict. And I can tell you that the Somalis are going to rally together. Whether it is Al-Shabaab, whether it is ISIL in Somalia, they want to rally together, because one of the major strategies of the Al-Shabaab is ultranationalism, to get all the 5 regions of Somalis back to one Somalia. Because I think one of the timings by Ethiopia is that Somalia is at her weakest point. But I can tell you this may not just be a point to be responded to effectively now, but at one time they'll definitely respond very vehemently. And of course, not let alone the geopolitics, where other powers are interested in Somalia. Somalia has such a huge resource base. They have petroleum base that is equivalent to the oil in Kuwait. And that's why the external powers from Europe and other Western countries are rallying with Somalia, because they know what lies beneath Somalia. And that will not make it very comfortable for Ethiopia. And so that may trigger a backlash if he does not succeed in his quest. So I think, yes, he has a very big point about landlocked countries, but the approach could be reminiscent of very serious challenges, both in Ethiopia, but also in the region.
Wow. I mean, just listening to that, Ambassador Mulongo, it's mind-blowing, really, just hearing that. And I have to point out that we have seen protests in Mogadishu all of this week, really, in regards to that deal. So, Professor Monda, coming to you, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed last year described access to the sea as an existential issue. What would be the economic gains for Ethiopia under this deal? And I know we had talked about this a little bit earlier. You talked about Ethiopia getting multiple opportunities for maritime transactions. And you also mentioned Somaliland, which would also benefit from Ethiopia's vast market. But let's just look at the benefits for Ethiopia alone.
I think that's an excellent point. And to build on what we're talking about earlier, landlocked countries, in addition to raising the cost of goods and services that they import, because they have to import through second countries, they're also very much constrained in terms of their foreign policy options. They have diplomatic, strategic, and foreign policy options. So if you think, for example, a country like Ethiopia with such a huge population, if it's landlocked, there's really a lot of constraints on it in terms of what it can bring into the country and what it can export, because it does not have direct access to global maritime shipping lanes. So when President Abiy, Prime Minister Abiy talks about access to a port being an existential threat, he's really referring to this idea that not having access to global maritime shipping lanes can actually cripple a country, it can destroy a country. He's really reinforcing the idea that Ethiopia wants to access multiple avenues to global commerce and global trade.
Okay, so Professor Nditi, listening to Professor Monda and Ambassador Mulongo, there's obviously here an issue that needs to be dealt with, a delicate issue. Somalia has called this deal an act of aggression. It said it would destabilize the region. Ambassador Mulongo has explained how we are likely to see Somalia galvanizing together should this deal go ahead. But let's talk about the region. What's the impact of it on the region?
We need to note 95% of Ethiopian trade deals or trade in that part of the world goes through Djibouti. Now, if Ethiopia decide to take the route of getting into partnership with Somaliland for the purpose of advancing international trade, of course, the purpose of Navy or the military would be to secure those strategic resources. It means that we lose on the LAPSET, the entire East Africa, you know, the LAPSET project that was begun by majority of states in the Eastern Africa, including Ethiopia, would be dead. And so, because Ethiopia will have gotten an alternative route, you know, to the Indian Ocean and to the international trade market. But those economic implications obviously have, you know, destabilizing factors within the region. If, for example, Somaliland, as we said earlier, it is getting into this deal as part of avoidance of isolation, because recently Somali, you know, joined hands with the 7 Eastern African countries to be part of the EAC. It means that Ethiopia and Somaliland will progressively get out of the East Africa and form, you know, an alliance that you know, would be away from the problems that the region experiences.
Unfortunately, we're almost out of time, but I'd like to get your final thoughts. And Ambassador Mulongo, I'll start with you. Somalia is now a member of the EAC. How does the EAC view this standoff?
Well, EAC has not made any decision yet, but definitely they're chewing the matter. And they will have to come in, given the treaty that brings the EAC countries together. I do not think that Somaliland is just being isolated, because as far as the instruments of sovereignty deposited with the UN, AU, and recently EAC, Somaliland is part of this, of Somalia. And so Somaliland will benefit just like any other part of Somalia in terms of the integration benefits that other member states, partner states enjoy. And so there is no isolation. So to me, I think it is one, the nature of the agreement that has aggravated the matter. Two, why did they involve the member states in the region, including Mogadishu, to state their intent and to state the fact that the interest is a matter of having additional ports. Perhaps that would have watered down the kind of reaction that we have now. But the issue of territorial extension exacerbates the matter, and it's a serious one. And I'm sure the EAC countries will also have to weigh in at some time to come in the future, including the external superpowers.
Right. So, Professor Nditi, then, we know that Somalia and Somaliland had agreed in December to resume talks to resolve the outstanding issues after these long-running political tensions and years of deadlock. With this issue now between Somaliland and Ethiopia, where does that leave the talks?
We may not see Somalia, you know, that is Mogadishu, and Hargeisa coming together to pursue the talks. We might have a third party to intermediate so that, you know, we can move forward. But more importantly, I think it would be important to develop some kind of a balance sheet, you know, between Addis Ababa, you know, Hargeisa and Mogadishu, to look at these issues in terms of what are the interests and how do we accommodate, you know, Hargeisa. Because, you know, we may agree or not, but the fact remains that, you know, Hargeisa, Somaliland, is feeling isolated. And so they are looking for a friend. When, you know, a territory is driven by those kind of instincts, it's also very hard to stop them. But we've also just heard that Ethiopia is also pursuing what we can call a renaissance. And that kind of renaissance, you know, exploiting the 1884, you know, Anglo-Ethiopian treaty that actually the British were in between. And so when you see those kind of tensions coming, they are not things you can just, you know, press a button. There will be need for a long haul of negotiations taking place in a neutral ground moving forward, so that, you know, a conclusive solution can be established.
Okay, so speaking of negotiations and mediation, Professor Monda, I'm coming to you for my final question. The African Union has urged all parties to cool tensions. I think we've also heard from the UN saying the same thing. And I think it was Ambassador Mulongo who said at some point, or it was Professor Nditi, but one of those two have said at some point the AU and perhaps the EAC will have to get involved. So how best then can this issue be resolved?
I think this issue can best be resolved through diplomatic channels, but we would need a neutral arbiter, a third party that is not vested within the interests of either Somaliland, Ethiopia, and Somalia. And I say that from two perspectives. Ethiopia has a unique position of not only being the seat of the African Union, but it also has incredible sort of historical significance within the region. Ethiopia has had many serious iterations with Somalia. They fought 2 wars. So this situation can get very complicated very quickly. So I think the infrastructure of the AU really has to be rekindled, and possibly might the IGAD, good officers of the IGAD, be used as a regional framework to try and bring some kind of a rapprochement between these two parties. Because ultimately, I see a symbiotic relationship where Ethiopia can still engage with Somaliland at a subnational level with the oversight of Mogadishu. But at the same time, Mogadishu also needs to give Somaliland more autonomy within a federalized system, so that Somaliland doesn't constantly feel constrained by the chaos that's going on in Mogadishu.
All right, thank you very much for that. It's a very insightful discussion there. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A very big thank you to all of my guests, Professor David Onserio Monda, Professor of Public Policy and Constitutional Law at City University of New York, Ambassador Simon Mulongo, former Deputy Head of AMISOM and Consultant on Governance, Peace and Security, and finally, Professor Francis Onditi with me here in studio, Associate Professor of Conflictology at the Riara University here in Kenya. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Peninah Karibe, and the entire team here in Nairobi. It's goodbye for now.